This is Section 7, Lecture 1. In this section, we're going to be talking about foreign policy bureaucracies, including the State Department, the CIA, the NSA, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Homeland Security. To begin with, let's talk about some theoretical advantages for bureaucracies. And one theoretical advantage is that they are created and oftentimes then allowed to act independently after their creation. And this is in part seen in the congressional deference to those bureaucracies. Congress creates bureaucracies. Congress technically has oversight of those bureaucracies. Congress pays for the bureaucracies in the budget. But oftentimes they tend to allow the bureaucracies to work independently. They oftentimes defer to the bureaucrats in their long-term expertise. And so if you are a congressman, perhaps you have a certain level of understanding about foreign policy, about defense policy, so on and so forth. But if you are a career bureaucrat in the State Department or in the Defense Department, you have a much better understanding of the ideas, of the theories, of the practices and principles for which you advise policies. And so then Congress defers to the advice oftentimes of the bureaucracies and only really exercises their oversight power when mistakes are made, when there's a crisis, or when there's some sort of major failure. Another influence of bureaucracies or advantage of bureaucracies are presidential limitations. And this goes back to our discussion about the organizational process model in the earlier lecture that we had on the Cuban Missile Crisis, that idea of author Graham Allison. Oftentimes, bureaucracies are given the same problem to solve. Multiple bureaucracies then have influence on any given issue or any given policy. But they also have their own expertise. And so agencies are given or allowed specific powers, specific dominance or domain in particular issue areas, and deference is given to the leaders of those bureaucracies and the advisors from those bureaucracies, and allows them to control policy, particularly, let's say, in a crisis situation where the president has a limited amount of time to make a decision and so must rely on the advice from the bureaucracies. Well, we talked about the problems with that: standard operating procedures, a satisficing decision. But nevertheless, these bureaucracies do have a large amount of power or influence in their given issue area. And this goes along with organizational expertise. Because they are experts in their issue area, because they have that long-term study and knowledge of a particular issue area, that means members of the Congress and the Senate and members of the executive branch, including the president, are going to defer to their advice. This idea listed here, called path dependency, has to do with the independence of these bureaucracies that I mentioned on the previous slide. A bureaucracy is created for a purpose, and so it fulfills that purpose. It goes on to tackle other issues, other policies. They're difficult to establish, and once they're established, they tend to be left in place because they're difficult then to uh, replace when you need someone to address that specific idea again. Even with the failures of bureaucracies, even with the failures of policymakers, these bureaucracies tend to stay in place. And so then, because they encompass a certain set of issue areas and have that expertise, they're going to be difficult to dismantle because policymakers rely on them. We mentioned several dysfunctions or disadvantages of bureaucracies in the organizational process model earlier in the class. This is where standard operating procedures are given as pieces of advice rather than perhaps taking a new situation on its own and studying it for itself. The new situation is molded to fit the old procedure because that's what the bureaucracy knows, that's what they're experts at. And this drives these bureaucracies and the policymakers within them to reaffirm their own organizational cultures and always represent similar advice based on their organization's culture, the path that they were set on, that is, that idea of path dependency. They're created for a purpose, and so they see their mission is to always address that issue or purpose. And so you're always going to get similar or same pieces of advice from these bureaucrats, despite the foreign policy situation, despite whether or not the piece of advice tackles the issue at hand. Again, those dysfunctions that we mentioned from the organizational process model. And an organization has this culture of shared values, shared goals, shared priorities. And so then a bureaucrat is going to seek to fulfill those rather than perhaps address at face value rationally a foreign policy situation that they face. The State Department is always going to favor diplomacy, and this leads them to the criticism of others of being weak and timid. Well, that's their job. That's what they were created for. Intelligence agencies are criticized for being too secretive to the point of failure of sharing information. But we have to look at the idea of path dependency and the organizational culture. That's why these intelligence agencies are created, to be secretive, to act in the shadows. But that idea of path dependency, their independence, and these organizational cultures oftentimes lead to potential failures of sharing information, sharing advice, and ultimately getting to the best advice to final decision makers. And so there was a study done in 2008 that I have there listed at the bottom of this slide. When it comes to foreign policy bureaucracies, the Pentagon often has dominance in all situations. If we look at our previous lecture on the budgets and congressional power in the budgets, we saw then that well over 50% of the discretionary budget of the United States goes to the Pentagon. Well, they have much more resources. They have a much larger personnel not just military personnel, but also civilian personnel. They are the largest employer in the world, the Pentagon. And so then, this gives them a dominance in foreign policy input. There is also a lack of resources given to civilian agencies, and we saw that dichotomy with the budget of the Defense Department and the budget of the State Department in earlier lectures. There's weak central leadership because these organizations are independent from one another, because they act independently. Then there's a weakness in combining all these different pieces of information, collecting them, and oftentimes coming up with the best answers to a given problem at hand. There's poor planning, inadequate reporting across agencies. This is a criticism that came in the wake of September 11th attacks, where one of the quotes from that time was that the system was blinking red, but nobody was connecting the dots. And this is because of the organizational cultures, one of these dysfunctions. These intelligence agencies weren't necessarily sharing information with one another. The FBI and the CIA and the NSA. And so then, their failure to share information with one another perhaps leads to foreign policy failures. A lack of budget coordination. More money goes to the Defense Department and the defense budget, which also includes the CIA and the National Security Agency. But of course, the CIA and the National Security Agency, because they're smaller, get a very small chunk of that budget. And so there are any number of problems that come up or arise with our foreign policy bureaucracies in a theoretical fashion. And all of this gets tied back to those criticisms that we mentioned earlier about the organizational process model, about the influence of bureaucracies, and about how perhaps the cultures, the standard operating procedures, the priorities of those bureaucracies may not always achieve the best and most rational decisions given to our final decision makers, including the president. In the next lecture, we're going to be talking about the State Department specifically, and then we'll go on to talk about others as well.